going on, everyone? John Matrix here. Hope you're all having yourselves a wonderful day. We've been exploring a lot of the Warhammer 40k universe, and I've been wanting to check out the Warhammer Fantasy universe, so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to jump into some Warhammer Fantasy here today. We're going to be checking out a video from Pancreas No Work. This is Do or Don't Warhammer the Old World. Links for that will be down below in the description to the original video of that, my commentary and reaction, and to Pancreas No Work's channel. So please do me a favor, if you enjoy this video as we go through it, be sure to go and give it a like, and be sure to hit that sub button on his channel if you enjoy the man's content. Right off the bat, I am a little bit more familiar starting off with the Total War, you know, games from them, from playing Total War Warhammer, you know, 1 through 3. I'm a little bit more familiar with the factions and some of the lore behind the factions and some of the major characters behind the factions, but I'm interested to learn a little bit more about specifics, how the universe got started, etc. You know, I know the Chaos Gods are the same ones from 40k that are in fantasy. You know, and I know there's the Skaven, the Beastmen, there's Chaos factions, and that's, you know, again separated into Chaos Undivided with Be'lakor and his stuff, and then, you know, Tzeentch and Nurgle and yada yada. So I'm familiar with some of that, more so starting off than what I was with 40k, but I'm still interested to, like I said, learn a bit more about the specifics of the Warhammer Fantasy, how much things are similar and how much they're different from 40k, etc., and how this universe kind of started. So that's what we're going to jump into here. So without further ado, let's get into this. Again, this is Do or Don't Warhammer the Old World by Pancreas No Work.
I never thought I would see the day Warhammer Fantasy came back, to be honest. By the time I got into Warhammer, 8th edition was finishing up in 40k, and Age of Sigmar was a decent way into 2nd edition. I figured getting anything out of the classic fantasy setting would be relegated to Total War, Vermintide, the occasional book, and buying secondhand minis at 500% markup prices. But then the Old World came out, and for once, I'm not late on a video for a release because I'm just myself and have no sense of timing. I wanted to see what would happen, how
I know that feel, man. I know that feel. Trying to get, you know, certain videos out for things that are, you know, stuff's going on, and then time just flies by because you got so many other things to do. I can relate.
The Old World would pan out. And by God, has it been shining, to the point that GW employees have said that the response was far and away beyond what they expected. The initial releases of Bretonnia and the Tomb Kings have sold out almost entirely immediately, and that has continued to be the case. The Greens.
So real quick, also, that is something that I'm interested to learn more about, is kind of the difference between, I guess, like the Old World and Age of Sigmar. Like, I think the Old World is like what Warhammer, my understanding anyway, the Old World is what Warhammer Fantasy used to be, you know, kind of how it originally was. And then Age of Sigmar is how they have things now. And from what I understand, I think they're trying, like Age of Sigmar, as far as like tabletop rules go, and maybe even some of the lore stuff goes, they're trying to make it a little more 40k-ish, but still in that fantasy setting. You know, I mean, I guess correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but that's what my understanding is as of right now. So I'm interested to learn a bit more of a difference, or what the difference is between, you know, the Old World and Age of Sigmar, etc., and what led up to the Age of Sigmar, if there is like an actual like lore event kind of a thing that happened, and then Age of Sigmar took place after that, or, you know, how that all worked out, or if Games Workshop was just like, nope, we're not supporting this anymore. This is what Warhammer Fantasy is going to be now. We're just renaming it Age of Sigmar. Here's a new rule set. This is what the new minis are going to be, factions, etc. You know, and they went from there.
Skins, the third faction to be reintroduced, have a hefty chunk of their kits sold out as well. Warhammer Fantasy is back, everyone. The World of Legend isn't just here once more, it's selling like mad. But saying that, it's been gone a long time, just about a decade. That's time for people's taste to change, or just for people to fall out of love with what once was. And either way, it was never as popular as 40k once that was introduced. A lot of people into Warhammer never gave it the chance it deserves. I'm here to fix that. Have you always been interested in the fantasy side of Warhammer but never took the plunge? Have you never even heard of it and want to understand what all the hype and excitement about the return is all about?
Seems for me like I have always been interested in fantasy, you know, the fantasy setting, and the Total War Warhammer games I am absolutely in love with. I think they're the best strategy games that have been out in a very long time, and I'm looking forward to seeing them finish up with this. And then, you know, I guess the rumor is that they're going to be making a 40k one. The thing for me that I think makes 40k a little bit more appealing, I guess, at least right now from my knowledge, is just like 40k incorporates a lot of those fantasy elements, but also does it in a sci-fi setting that also incorporates a lot of other things that I'm interested in, you know? And just the, like, the mythology of it, the kind of heroes, you know, and villains, the Emperor being, as you know, an interesting character, the Primarchs, and, you know, those that have betrayed, those that are still loyal, you know, all that kind of stuff is all just fascinating to me. And I just don't know enough about fantasy to know if there are similar things like that. You know, I mean, I know there are heroes and champions, but I don't know. It doesn't feel like it's on that same level as like 40k does, I guess, you know, like, to my understanding, like Sigmar is kind of like the Emperor of the Warhammer Fantasy setting, but he's not like as all powerful, you know, et cetera, like the Emperor was. Kind of a situation, you know. So I don't know, but anyway, I'm interested to learn more about him and the fantasy, like I said. So, but that's just what appeals to me about the 40k versus the fantasy setting.
Or are you a grizzled old veteran neckbeard curious what the return of a setting long lost looks like? Well, I've got no idea if I can answer those questions for you, but I've got the core rulebook, some Tomb King miniatures, and a can-do attitude.
I love the Tomb Kings.
So let's see
Tomb
if
Kings are one
Warhammer
of my
the
favorite
Old World
factions.
is right for you. Before we start going on about the Old World for the next half an hour plus, however, a word if you will.
I am a little bit of a normie from the Total War Warhammer games, the Empire, you know, Kyle Franz. They're probably my favorite faction. I just enjoy the versatility of them, and it's fun having steam tanks, you know what I'm saying? But also, I really like the High Elves, you know? Again, I'm pretty kind of, you know, kind of a normie, I guess you could say, but as far as those factions goes, but I think it would go probably the Empire, High Elves, and then Tomb Kings for me as far as factions that I enjoy in Warhammer Fantasy, at least in the Total War Warhammer game. Although I have been liking Kislev and the other new faction, the kind of Chinese themed faction. I can't think of their names off the top of my head right now, but I think they just had a DLC with like the Jade Emperor, and I've been liking playing as that champion. Xenophobic dinosaurs for the win. Yeah, the Lizardmen are pretty dope too. I do like the Lizardmen too. They're pretty fun. Having a bunch of Triceratopses and T-Rexes running around, just raffle stomping everything. I don't know, man, but there's something. I forget the general's name, but the High Elves general who is all about the dragons. There's just something about having an army of a bunch of dragons just raining fire down on enemy, you know, groupings, and then having them just fly down in their back line and just tear everything up. It's a beautiful sight. Anyway, let's continue.
You may or may not know about me, sleep is something I quite enjoy. It's the only time of day where you can feasibly do absolutely nothing, because no one expects anything out of you when you're unconscious, and my dreams are like really weird television, so it's even better for me.
Alright, I'll skip ahead of this, but he's got a Helix Sleep sponsor here. I'm assuming links will be down below in his description of his video. This video that I'm watching here now, I think is 9 months old, so if the sponsor's still going for him, if you'd like to support his channel, check it out if you're looking for a new mattress.
Now then, it's time to discuss the original Warhammer. As a forewarning, I had a bit of a balancing act to perform with this video. I wanted to make sure I got all the lore across that you need, and also, I am this GIF when it comes to Warhammer Fantasy.
Normal people, when they get stuck in a room with a Warhammer fan who has 12-hour lore, yeah, okay.
But I'm also trying to make
Fair.
this even more so than my usual stuff as a primer. A sort of, hey guys, what's the old world all about? What are the basic pros and cons of it? That sort of deal. So as a reminder at the start here, you can skip ahead to the pros and cons. They're timestamped in the description, and you can probably see them segmented in the play bar of the video. If you want to have lore vomited all over you, just sit tight, we're going to start that soon. But if you just want to see if this game sounds remotely interesting, just go on and skip ahead. It'll only hurt my feelings a tiny bit, I get it. Warhammer the Old World is Warhammer Fantasy brought back to life and set a few hundred years prior to the timeline of the original fantasy setting.
Okay.
Much like in 40k, the old ones in the time of prehistory were doing their thing, being super powerful magical beings of which we know almost nothing about. Instead of very pointedly refusing to help the Necrons overcome their space cancer, however, here they were looking for something else they found in what would become the Warhammer world. Before their arrival, it was a cold world of dragons and savage races we will never know the names of. Then the old ones plopped down, decided this was as good a place as any to set up shop, and moved the entire damn thing closer to the sun to warm it up. The dragons and everyone else naturally did not like this, but their compliance was never a factor. They immediately began reshaping the world to their liking, creating the race of the lizardmen to see their will done. Two massive—
Yeah, I didn't know that. Like, the lizardmen were kind of like the first race. And they were kind of set up, I guess, as servants. Are the old ones the Slann? Or are those, again, like their high priests? I always got kind of confused with that.
Portals were built to allow them to ferry materials and magic into the world for them to use, one at each pole. They created the Slann, massive fat toads who are so intelligent and magically powerful they mold the world like clay. Just to give you an idea of what these fat bastards can do, let's jump ahead a bit. Once upon a time, the Dark Elves were invading the Lizardmen, and one of the Slann naturally wasn't a fan of this. To counteract the invasion, he decided to create a mountain range between the Elves and the Lizardmen. One moment there were no mountains, the next there were mountains. Powerful indeed. There was also the Skinks, their small craftsmen, the Kroxigors, dumb labor, and the Saurus, the method by which they disposed of races not suited to their plans. Of the few races that survived were most prominently the Dragons, who would come to befriend either the Elves or the Chinese, the Greenskins, who hitched a ride on their spaceships and kinda just spread out across the entire planet, and the Dragon Ogres, who are a lot less important than that name would make you think. They're also neither dragons nor ogres, so the name's lying to you. Rats also exist on that planet. Keep that in mind. You'll notice that they make the world look like Earth if it was drawn by someone tweaking on math. With the bedrock of their plan set, Phase 2 would come—
I always found that interesting too, is that, you know, it's essentially Earth, but like ravaged in different ways. You know, North America is pretty foobar. It's kind of almost cut in half. And then we've got this weird, you know, island over here. South America is kind of somewhat the same. You know, most of everything else, Europe's a little bit cut down, etc.
Commence. The planet was now mostly formed as they would like, and would come to fully form in time naturally, so now it was time to fill it with all the generic fantasy races you could expect. These races would come to form both beautiful civilizations and perhaps even become the ultimate weapon against the dark gods. First were the Elves. Long-lived, elegant, and highly magical in their nature, they were gifted the magical floating island of Ulthuan to live on. It's basically the Garden of Eden if you crossed it with Atlantis. Unfortunately, they were both somehow too full of kindness as well as incredibly arrogant, and would put themselves and their kinsmen before anyone else. They were also a bit too frail, not the toughest bunch around. If you got past their defenses, the most they could do to keep you from ripping them apart was really hoping that you didn't. And at the heart of every elf, deeper than their love for the world, was a lust for glory and greatness in battle that would lead many of them to a dark path. So since the elves weren't perfect, it was time for the next bunch, the dwarfs. That's dwarfs, by the way, not dwarves. They were the opposite of the elves. They were devoutly loyal to their kinsmen, of course, but would always do what they saw as right before anything else.
You like me some dwarves?
They were stubborn and unyielding, both to better keep themselves protected from Chaos's lies and to help them club to death anything that tries to bother them. But they weren't made so warlike as the elves that they would seek out glory in battle if it wasn't required. They were smart and industrious, building massive mountain homes and great technologies alike. and they were made to be so awful at using magic that it was drained by their very presence. All the better to fight the magically made demons of chaos. Unfortunately, being stubborn not only meant that their technology and society advanced at a snail's pace because new things bad, but also that calling one of them an asshole would start a generations-long war as they sought to avenge the slight. Not being able to use magic also ended up as more of a hindrance than anything, because while being resistant to spells is nice, being able to wipe out a regiment with a fireball is even more nice. So while the elves and dwarves are both wondrous creations, they weren't the ultimate weapon the old ones wanted. So up next was mankind.
I mean, when you're a dwarf, do you really need magic when you have grenades, you know? Like, only some people are able to really throw fireballs with magic. Anyone can make and throw grenades, you know what I'm saying? Get some sappers out there, just throwing out those grenades. Saying.
You and me. Mankind was made to be inherently ambitious so that they would achieve great things. They would not be content with the works of their ancestors nor the paradise they already had, as the dwarves and elves were. They were made to be magically capable, but not so much as the elves. They were made to be able to inhabit almost anywhere with a bit of effort so that they would spread far and wide. Speaking as a human myself, in some ways the old ones hit the mark with mankind. In the coming fights that would plague the planet, their ambition would mean it was often mankind who would drive back the darkness of the world, but in others they were the weakest. They were ultimately the most vulnerable to corruption and outside forces such as chaos, as the deep-seated ambition of man meant that a human would do whatever it took to achieve their goals. And if whatever it took meant killing a few thousand people in the name of the dark gods, it's just what's gotta be done. Can't fault a man for hustling. But at this point, the old ones were getting a bit pressed for time in their minds, so they just started throwing shit at the wall and hoping it stuck. And to be fair, they seem to have nearly gotten it towards the end. Their second to last race was the halflings. On paper, the halflings are useless. They were shorter than dwarfs and not nearly as tough, generally not great in a fight and pretty cowardly to boot, and had the most voracious appetites on the planet. But they were incredibly resistant to the draw of chaos, so the old ones took what they learned and created the ogres. They were massive, capable of magic, reasonably ambitious, and pretty resistant to chaos as well. But just before the old ones could give them a land capable of housing them, as well as curbing their ever greater hunger, disaster. Chaos erupted into the world at the polar gates the old ones were using. For whatever reason, the moment this happened, the old ones just left. They might not be as dickish as they were in 40k, but they're...
Yeah, that was something that I always found interesting in the lore. There's like, oh, chaos is here. Later, guys. We have to figure things out here. You know what I'm saying? It's like,
apparently infinitely more cowardly. Left unfinished and unprepared as most of the races they created were, it fell to the lizardmen and elves to mount the main defense. Mostly the lizardmen, because the armies of the elves were entirely untested by this point. Across the world, billions of lizardmen fought billions of demons. The races of the old ones, for the most part, were sidelined this early on. The dwarves, for the most part, closed the doors to their mountain holds and just waited it out, although their ancestor god Grimnir decided to take up a part-time job as Doom Guy and march directly into the realm of chaos to murder demons forever. To be fair to them, he did lead an army of a bunch of dwarfs, though to not be fair to them, there was still a whole lot more dwarfs who just sat in their mountains and did nothing. Mankind was all over the place, with the ancestors of some factions fighting alongside their gods against chaos, while others hid in caves and waited for the scary things to go away. Many mutated into the vile beastmen, who would hunt any who entered their sacred realms. Their sacred realms, of course, being anywhere with more than 0 trees per square mile. And the ogres and halflings existed. Certainly they were around for this time, doing things and stuff. Rats also still exist on this planet. The lizardmen were fighting well, but were hard-pressed. The spawning pools they come from were frequently corrupted, and in the case of the Slann, entirely destroyed. Every lizardman took down 10 demons or more before they died, but it wasn't enough to do more than barely hold out. Except for one of the Slann. He died, he just decided it wasn't actually important and kept on trucking. As for the elves, they were going through it. Armies getting smashed, demons as it turns out just respawn after enough time, and overall not much in the way of permanent solutions. Then 2 cool fellas named Anarion and Kalor rose up. Anarion was such a great warrior that he regularly fought greater demons and came out on top, and Kalor...
Excuse me. I was about to talk, and then some spit went down the wrong airway there. Good stuff. That's something that I've thought was like, I mean, he's kind of, you know, glossing over and just summarizing things a little bit, but it's always something that I've wondered, right? Like, with how frail the elves were supposed to have been back then, like, how did these great warriors just all of a sudden come out of nowhere without using magic or only some magic and were able to take on, you know, these greater demons? You know, like, I know there were some warriors that were able to, you know, wield magic, but I think these two like greater guys are talking about, they didn't really use a lot of magic, to my understanding. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I just always found that interesting. Just all of a sudden, these great warriors were, you know, just capable of taking on greater demons, just kind of appeared.
Or was the type of wizard who could turn you inside out asshole first if you annoyed him. Anarian grabbed something called the Sword of Cain, which every single god except for Cain was telling him not to do, and proceeded to kill even more demons, so good on him. Kalidor, in conjunction with whatever Slann were left alive, created a magical vortex which drained magic from the world. This caused the demons to lose form as they required ambient magic to exist in the real world, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief. We'll speedrun things a little bit so we can get to the meat of this video. Anarian disappeared, his first ex-wife who everyone thought was killed by demons came back with their kids and formed the line of Anarian. They're cursed for all time because Daddy picking up the Sword of Cain made his bloodline a bit angsty. His ex-lover after her, Morathi, gave birth to a kid named Malekith. Malekith was a great hero for the elves until he wasn't, and he and his mom caused a little bit of a civil war.
And he was supposed to be, like, I guess, first in line for to become the Phoenix King, I think. But for whatever reason was nixed out of that, I guess because they felt like he was a little too dark in some of the things that he did. So then that's, I think, when he left and like formed the Dark Elf faction here with his mother that they were talking about. I think that's what happened. Again, feel free to correct me in the comments and fill me in a little bit more on those details.
War, leading to the creation of the Dark Elves. The Greenskins continue to exist on this planet and keep punching the closest thing to them in the face. You don't need to know much about—
Yeah, I mean, orcs are orcs, right? It's pretty much the same way in the 40k universe as they are here. And I think they worship the same gods too, like Gork and Mork or whatever. I never remember the names right.
Greenskin lore, it's pretty similar across the board. Sometimes they get close to punching something really important to the integrity of the world in the face, and then they usually get stopped right before they can do it. At some point, the rats that continue to exist on this planet got a bit bigger. Actually, a whole lot bit bigger. So big, in fact, that they learned how to use magic, eat magical hell rocks, turned those rocks into crack, and outpopulated every other race
instead of a K.
These are the Skaven, and their history can be summarized as this. They spend all their time fighting each other until they very briefly unite, during which time they will devour everything that gets in their way until they cock it up. Rinse and repeat that cycle for all of their recorded history. As for humanity, in not Europe, they were still hiding in caves. In not China, they were forming a kingdom under the guidance of the dragons who didn't shack up with the elves. And in not Africa, they made not Egypt. It was good for a while. A really cool dude named Cetra conquered most of the world, and overall it was pretty prosperous.
Basically, the
Necrons,
a real
piece of work named Nagash came around, caused some shenanigans, and turned all of the not Egyptians into skeletons and mummies. This, if anything, made them more powerful, because now when you kill them, they just respawn and come back to kick your ass while you're weakened.
Again, Necrons are Tomb Kings. Basically the same thing, just, you know, more ancient Egyptian fantasy flair instead of futuristic sci-fi Terminator Egyptian flair.
Gash also invented necromancy, created vampires, and generally lessened the quality of life on the planet for all time. Such is his power. Nagash was defeated by a man named Al-Khadizar, as well as Skaven wizards blasting him in the face with magic every time he tried to lift his sword. He comes back every now and then to make things worse for people, only for him to be sent screaming back to hell. Somewhat relatedly, Malekith and Morathi weren't done causing a good 80% of the woes in this world. They decided that a fantastic way to get more high elves killed would be to make the dwarfs do it. So they sent some dark elves disguised as high elves to raid a bunch of dwarf caravans. The dwarfs and high elves were friends at this point still, so the dwarf high king just sent a diplomat to the elf Phoenix King to be like, yo dude, what the hell's this all about? The Phoenix King of this time was a colossal moron, so he tells the dwarfs to piss off. They demand gold after this, whereupon the Phoenix King shaves the beards of the dwarf diplomats. Because the only thing dwarfs really care about—
that's a no-no. That's a big, that, you know, that's going right in the book, and they are not erasing that anytime soon.
Our gold and their beards, this leads to Fantasy World War II as the dwarf and elf empires go to town on each other. They bankrupt themselves, kill millions, and generally make things worse for each other. The dwarfs ultimately win the war, though it's quite the Pyrrhic victory. Malekith invades Ulthuan, forcing the elves to recall their colonists. The Phoenix King of the elves was beheaded by the dwarves, and generally everyone is worse off. Some of the elven colonists decide they quite like living in a magical forest, though, and stay behind to become the Wood Elves. They are insane. The High Elves then enter a pattern of recovery and getting their dicks flattened every...
I mean, that makes sense. The War of the Beard, that sounds like it would make sense. That's how the Wood Elves became, like, you know, people that fled from that war just went to a magical, you know, grove and became Wood Elves.
Few hundred years. The dwarfs, meanwhile, enter a pattern of things constantly getting worse every few hundred years. For instance, the Slan decided the feng shui of the mountains wasn't quite right, so they moved several of them around a little bit. Because the dwarves lived in those mountains, this is not great for the structural integrity of their homes. The Skaven, meanwhile, built a machine to hollow out entire mountain ranges. It blows up, which still hollows out mountain ranges, and kills both most of the Skaven and a lot more dwarfs. Now most of their homes are filled.
I do find that hilarious that so much of the Skaven technology just ends up wiping them out. But because they, like, populate so quick, it, like, doesn't matter.
Filled with man-sized rats and goblins. Some of them also wandered a bit too far away and got cut off from their gods, becoming the Chaos Dwarfs. They make weapons and magical runes like normal dwarfs do, but evilly and with slavery. You don't need to know much beyond that because they unfortunately don't get up to too much. Eventually, a cool guy named...
Yeah, that's what, to my understanding, there's not really a whole lot more, even though, like, they're their own faction, there's not really a whole lot that's been done with Chaos Dwarves. Maybe, I guess, with the revival of the old world, they'll do more with them. We'll get to know more about them.
Sigmar is born. He likes killing chaos and orcs. He's so good at killing orcs, in fact, that the dwarfs swear eternal friendship with the nation of the Empire of Man that he forms by uniting almost all of the non-Europeans.
Make him the Warhammer.
He also beat up the resurrected Nagash at one point, and halted the first ever major chaos invasion of the world since they broke into reality in the first place. After 50 years of ruling, he decided it was best to leave his nation to its own devices, or he just couldn't be bothered to do it anymore.
Seeing, like, this is something that I often kind of wonder, right? Like, I know they're technically supposed to be kind of like separate universes, but to my understanding, there have been certain kind of things and hints throughout the lore that say that, you know, perhaps Warhammer Fantasy was just like a really ancient time in the 40K timeline, you know what I'm saying? So it makes me wonder if Sigmar, in fact, wasn't, you know, the Emperor, and he just didn't use his psychic powers at the time. But, you know, united humanity at that time, fended off chaos, you know, et cetera, and then, you know, faded away and walked into the sunset afterwards. You know, that's often something that I've wondered. But anyway.
Clear. The Empire of Man becomes the not Germans of the land, and in time the mightiest human nation in all the world. Because
basically
Sigmar
the Holy
had
Roman
no
Empire.
known children, a system was put into place where the rulers of each of his provinces of the Empire would elect the Emperor to lead, with these nobles becoming known as the Elector Counts. For the not Europeans who didn't unite the Empire of Man, we have three major other groups. First is Kislev. Kislev is a mixture of every Slavic country ever, mostly Poland and Russia. It's cold, demons attack every few minutes, so they constantly deal with that, and they really like vodka. To counteract the constant threats they have to face, they have ice magic and bear cavalry, which usually solves things pretty well. In the grand scheme of things, they're
and that bear cavalry in the game actually does that very, very well.
Incredibly important nation, because every chaos invasion coming from the north, where they're mostly located, has to go through thousands of angry, drunken winged hussars first. But they're also pretty simple to understand, so no need to go too in-depth at the moment. The second group is what I'm combining Talea and Estalia into. Tylea is Renaissance Italy if it lived next to the capital of the man-eating, cocaine-snorting ratmen. Despite that, it's actually not too bad of a place to be, especially if you love political assassinations. Estalia is Renaissance Spain, but without the colonial empire. They don't do too much, though they did at one point crusade into Araby. Araby, meanwhile, is even less important of a human nation than Estalia, because its lore starts and ends with Estalia crusaded into it alongside some others. The last group is Bretonia. I do not like Bretonia. They were too arrogant to join Sigmar's realm and saw themselves...
I don't know enough about the faction lore-wise, but I agree here from, like, the Total War Warhammer game perspective. I don't really care for Bretonia at all. I've tried playing them several different times. I just don't like the faction. I don't know. That whole kind of somewhat Arthurian... Like, I like Arthurian lore, you know, but I don't know, the way it's depicted in this, I don't know, it just doesn't really do it for me.
...is better than him, and instead saw High Elf cavalry and decided to turn their entire culture into a Silver Helms LARP. They spend their time oppressing their peasants, molesting horses, drinking elf goddess bathwater because they think that their god isn't just an elf goddess playing their whole culture like a fiddle, and being manipulated by the wood elves. They took almost 1,000 years after the time of Sigmar to become a proper nation, and ever since then they have very purposely refused to advance past the medieval era. The only good Bretonnian is their founder/ghostly guardian, Giles Le Breton, the Green Knight. This is in part because the only potentially good Bretonnian is a dead one. If you collect this army, I think less of you. At one point, vampires decided the Empire was as nice a place to set up shop as any, so they took over the province of Sylvania, which somehow made that shithole state a better place to live in. The Empire goes to war with them every now and then. There may only be a few vampires, relatively speaking, but they can raise thousands of undead at a moment's notice.
I like the vampire faction too. They're fun to play.
Finally, we have the Norskins. They're Vikings. Some of them wandered up there on their own. The rest were driven up there by Sigmar after he killed a whole lot of their ancestors. Most of them worship the dark gods and are generally not nice folk. Some of them are so good at being Vikings that they bolt cursed armor to themselves and use it to be an even better Viking. Every now and then, one of them is such a good Viking that he ascends to being a demon prince. Now they're immortal, look pretty funky, and depending on their patron god, may or may not be incredibly angry, tricksy, smelly, or horny. As time advanced, the civilizations of the world advanced with it. By modern Warhammer Fantasy, like what we had 10 years ago, the Empire was very firmly in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. Factories were springing up more and more, the army was being armed more and more with standardized equipment.
Like I said, steam tanks. I love steam tanks. They're fun to roll over, you know, enemies with in the campaign.
And firearms, and hell, they had tanks.
Yeah.
Really crappy ones, but still tanks. And
I mean, for a monstrous unit, yeah, they definitely aren't the best, but I still enjoy using them.
Magic users were finally getting past the stage of all being burned at the stake for witchcraft. Now it's only 50% of them, 60% tops. But in the old world, we aren't quite there yet. Magic is still demonized, firearms and factories, while still present, are in far fewer number, and generally, it's just a bit more antiquated. Don't think that means the old world is any less eventful than modern Warhammer Fantasy. The Empire for centuries has been in the Age of Three Emperors, where the true claimant to the throne is in heavy dispute. In Bretonnia, the king has declared an errantry war to purge greenskins of his land. In Nagaroth, the Dark Elves plot their latest invasion of Ulthuan to retake what they believe to be rightfully theirs from the High Elf pretenders. The dwarfs continue to get their rocks and stones crushed by orcs and goblins, and far in the north, the armies of chaos once again begin to stir. Warriors of chaos begin gathering in ever greater number, and in time an Everchosen will unite them into a legion destined to bring terror and fury unmatched to the old world. And you, dear viewer, now have the chance to not just play Warhammer Fantasy, but Warhammer Fantasy in the age that defined what it would be by the modern era of the setting. So either dust off those old armies, or get ready to experience for the first time the true joy of rank and flank in an age of war and strife, but also of hope and heroism. As always, let's go through the pros and cons of the old world, starting with the lore. For lore positives of the old world, let me just start with what drew me to the setting. Full disclosure, I prefer fantasy to sci-fi, but the fantasy's gotta have some kick to it for me to really get into it. Like Dark Souls, where the kick is the enemies, boss, and setting as a whole kicking you to death at every chance.
True.
Warhammer Fantasy's kick to me, and by extension the kick of the old world, is that it goes out of its way to explain every single aspect of its setting. Given that fantasy was originally designed by history major fantasy nerds, this makes sense. For example, I'm sure you know that elves and dwarfs don't get along a lot of the time. Normally, if you asked your D&D...
That's basically like every fantasy setting, right? Like every fantasy setting, dwarves and elves just don't like each other. That's just how it is.
DMY, they might say something along the lines of, because they're elves and dwarves, and you're supposed to just accept it as how things are supposed to be. A slightly more savvy DM might say something about how the elves and dwarves have racial differences that just means they're not the best of friends. It takes a lot to get them to get along. In Warhammer, the reason elves and dwarves dislike each other is because of a decades-long conflict brought about by diplomatic incompetence, sabotage by a rival power, each of the races being incredibly long-lived and therefore having much more vivid memories of the wrongs done to them,
and holding on the grudges
that had been boiling away in the background up until the conflict broke out. This conflict, by the way, the War of Vengeance, has an entire trilogy of books dedicated to it, and that's my second related major praise for the setting. If you're curious about an aspect of it, you will find absolutely no shortage of content about it. The Rise of Sigmar and the Creation of the Empire has books, Nagash's Rise specifically has books, the Civil War between the High and Dark Elves has books, and you know, this is a video about the old world and fantasy, but let me complain about 40k for a bit. The War in Heaven is the founding conflict of 40k.
Yeah, I think I know where he's going for this, right? Like, And I think, relatively speaking, the lore about the War in Heaven is, like the War in Heaven itself, what they've talked about is new. So I feel like they might still flesh it out a little bit more. But yeah, it's like, that's something that I want to know more about. I want to know more about the War in Heaven. I want to know more about the old ones, the Catan or Satan, whatever they want to, call them. The creation of the elves and the orcs, what they used to be, Grorks or whatever they were called before they devolved into orcs. And I just want to know more about the wars and the battles, and there had to have been other alien races and things that got riled up into this, et cetera, et cetera. It would be something that I would like them to expand more upon. So I feel like that's where he's going with this, where Warhammer Fantasy has done that. They've really expanded on the creation of the universe and the worlds from start to where it is presently. Whereas 40K, they're still, I guess, either maybe fleshing that out or just are leaving it up to mystery.
The reason everything sucks so bad there can be traced back to that war. And what do we know about that war? Not much, most of which is revealed in snippets of dialogues by Necrons and very occasionally in Eldar. This is the conflict that started the setting as a whole and made the factions in it what they are, and we know almost dick about it. And I get that to some extent, mysteries mean things can be more intriguing and interesting.
And I mean, in that setting, it kind of also does make sense of the fact that it's such a long timeline, right? That history kind of has been forgotten in some regards. But at the same time, right, you have the Necron, and they're essentially immortal, and you've got beings in the Necron who were there from the start of that. So you could have, from the Necron's perspective, some kind of story that gets into that and talks about, the War in Heaven from their perspective.
Interesting to think about, food for thought and all that. But there's an intriguing mystery, and then there's not telling your audience anything.
Right.
And either way, I'm a history major. I want to know every single bit of reason that something is the way that it is.
I'm not a history major, but I'm there with them, right? Like, some things it's okay to leave a mystery, like, again, the Emperor. Like, I feel like the Emperor to me is the most fascinating character in the 40K setting, just because of how much mystery is around him, and the idea of, is everything that's happened since he united humanity part of his plan? The whole him getting injured by Horus and making the Primarchs, did he know they were going to get corrupted by chaos? And all the things that happen, is that all been part of his plan? And even him getting injured and being put on the throne, and being fed these souls and yada yada. Or was that all part of his plan to make him stronger in the warp and the spiritual realm, so that he could combat the chaos demons better, or not? Is it all just a facade, I guess? I don't know, but that's like the leaving those kind of mysteries like that are one thing, but then, like, again, like he said, the fact that the War in Heaven has literally the thing that spawned the entire universe, and everything that's happened has derived or diverged from that. And we don't know, like, literally anything about it, other than the Necrons were a race called the Necrontyr. They lived on a planet that was, full of radiation, and they were sick all the time. They got in contact somehow with the old ones, asked them for help. The old ones told them to F off. The Necrons didn't like it. They got into a war. Necrons were getting their asses kicked. They found the Catan or the Satan, however you want to pronounce it. They helped them out, but tricked them, ended up, taking the Necron souls and turning them into, from the Necrontyr to what they are now, and yada yada. And that's basically all we really know. The Necron eventually found out and turned on the Catan and imprisoned them, and then used them now as giant batteries to power their civilizations. But That's really all we kind of really know. Eventually, sometime, the elves were made by the old ones to combat them, and the orcs were made by the old ones to combat them, and maybe even humans, but humans, perhaps didn't get evolved quick enough to make any kind of difference before it was too late. And then the old ones, as far as we know, have been killed off, and that's it. That's all we know. And then the Necrons decided to take a nap. Okay.
Warhammer Fantasy has mystery, sure, don't get me wrong. There's smaller character-based mysteries like, is Balthasar Gelt wearing a mask to hide disfigurement, or is that just his head now after his experiment partially turned him into a golden statue? There's some more middle-of-the-road size mysteries like what in the name of God was the sleeper from Gotrek and Felix, aside from utterly horrifying. As an aside, Fall In Sons of Karak Hirn, There Is Sad Work to Be Done, is one of the most depressing things I've ever read, second only to Snorri Can't Remember right now. There's larger mysteries like who exactly is the Lady of the Lake, or what is she? That one doesn't really count as a mystery anymore after the end times revealed it, but I'm hoping you get my point. For the most part, if you have a question about an event in the old world, it either has entire books written about it, or it doesn't because it doesn't need those books, since all there is to tell about something can be told in some lore paragraphs. Another great thing this setting has going for it is that everything in it has some sort of unique flair to make them stand out a bit more from any counterparts in other media they might have. Perhaps the most influential thing to come out of Warhammer Fantasy is orcs being green. Yeah, this setting is the reason that's popular. The whole mushroom football hooligans never really spread out of Warhammer, but the color sure did. For some more low-key stuff, the Dowie of Warhammer may be pretty standard fantasy dwarves, but they do have their key features that make them different. For one, they're industrious beyond any other. Usually dwarven industry and craftsmanship is relegated to stuff like making really good weapons and armor, and their short stature hides some pretty intense musculature. Warhammer dwarves have that, sure, as well as the mandatory alcoholism and beards, but they're built wider than they are tall, and their industry isn't just making top-tier swords and shields. They have cannons. Multi-barreled cannons.
They're actually, technologically speaking, well, I don't know, maybe the Skaven are, right? I was going to say the dwarves, technologically speaking, are probably the most advanced faction, but the Skaven might be, because technically the Skaven have nukes, so there is that, but they're definitely one of the more advanced ones.
Cannons.
I mean, they got helicopters, brother. They literally have dwarves flying around on gyrocopters, like
shoot fire, handheld rocket launchers. They have helicopters and flying blimps they use to rain fire down on their enemies. They also have long memories.
It's true. I mean, yeah, the Skaven don't really know how most of the stuff works. They just kind of throw it all together. But I mean, they have the Skaven mess around with genetic modification, and they have nukes, and they have, Bratling gunners, and they got all kinds of crazy stuff. So just scheming, zooming on cat. Yeah, exactly.
Long memories they use to keep note of every single person who has wronged them so they can later beat the shit out of them for wronging them. The Wood Elves of Warhammer, meanwhile, are of course tree-loving hippies, but they're tree-loving hippies who live in a time-warping eldritch forest who are equally likely to eat you alive or throw you a feast and let you walk free.
That's something that I found interesting about them. They basically they're kind of cannibalistic, I guess, because they'll eat whatever.
Usually before a living tree eats you alive instead. And to relate to my last point, yes, there are extensive explanations as to why all these factions are the way they are. Another positive for the setting is that, like I said before, it advances. The Empire in the time of the Old World is in the midst of a bit of a...
Yeah, that's true. Like, that's one thing about 40K. Up until recently, they haven't really advanced a lot of stuff in the timeline. It seems like they're starting to do that now, though.
Power struggle. The dwarves at this time are surely before a period where as a whole they get massively reinvigorated to retake their lost territory rather than waiting out the end of the world. The High Elves at this time are beginning to realize they too can't afford to sit on their island of Ulthuan being all superior and elven. They need to tie themselves to the other factions of the world in order to survive. As I said before, this era of Warhammer Fantasy was a pretty foundational one for what the factions of modern fantasy would become. Most of them anyways, Bretonnia stays in backwater medieval stasis for all time until their rightful execution. So the truly big advancements and changes in these civilizations does come after the old world, but you can see how these things begin to play out. Besides, the Empire of Man didn't start as it is now. In the beginning, iron swords were the pinnacle of technology, and most of them lived in fur clothing and tents as barbarian tribes. But they changed, they advanced, and that's something pretty unique from the medieval stasis most fantasy settings live in. For all that matter, being able to play in this time period is its own positive, especially for fans of the old fantasy era. This is basically the Horus Heresy for Warhammer Fantasy, so we're hopefully likely to see things such as the foundation of the colleges of magic in the Empire, Thorgrim's rise to power and the Age of Reckoning starting, and the High Elves truly reaching out to the world rather than just sending an army out every now and again before going home. The timeline shown in the core rulebook ends about 100 years before the Great War against Chaos and Magnus the Pious ending the Age of Three Emperors, but depending on what GW has planned, we may either see these things play out or the build up towards them. Both would be fine to me. Either we get a more in-depth look at an interesting period, or we see the lead-up to things that we already largely know how play out. This setting is also a lot more...
It wouldn't surprise me if they kind of do both, right? They flesh out the old world more and have it play into what people already know.
Heroic than 40k. It's Warhammer, it's gonna be depressing. This era involves orcs being an absolute menace to Bretonnia and somehow making it even worse to live there, the Empire being heavily divided, and Chaos getting ready to start the largest incursion it's ever done. But to put it bluntly, the people in it aren't 40k characters. They aren't brainwashed, hate-filled soldiers who hate people different than them because they are different than them. They're grimy, superstitious peasants, but they're generally happy enough to see a dwarf. The gods that aren't the Chaos Guards are usually far more benevolent than they are malicious.
Yeah, I guess that is something, right? Like, a lot of the things the way they are in 40k is because of just like belief in doctrine, especially with the Imperium, right? You know, just a lot of the reason why people do certain things is because of that zealotry, just, you know, what they've been programmed to believe. Whereas in fantasy, I guess, even it's kind of strange, right? Like, I guess maybe it's another one of those 40k ironies in the fantasy setting that is taking place, you know, way back in the ancient past. People are more open-minded and free thinking than they are in the 40k setting, right? It's kind of interesting, but yeah, I guess you could say that, right? Yeah.
Some exceptions, such as Cain. Excepting the evil factions, of course, the people in this setting don't fight to purge the Xeno, because someone worshipping the wrong god is heresy, or for other petty, abominable reasons. They fight because they want to live another day, and while they may be morally gray at times, the causes they champion are usually righteous. Somewhat relatedly, it's a lot easier to relate to the people of the old world. I'm not a space marine. I can't understand what it's like to truly be one, and you probably can't either, because I'm assuming you're not an indoctrinated child super soldier.
I don't know what he's talking about, man. You know, I can, you know, lift cars up, you know, I can shoulder press, you know, little Prius like it's nothing. Pick up an orc and squish its head with my hand, you know. That's just everyday stuff, you know. That's just petty everyday stuff.
You're not a pious battle nun who's so faithful the sheer power of her holy hatred manifests miracles. You're also not a Tyranid, I hope. Even the more human-like alien races in 40k aren't exactly relatable. An evil goddess my great-grandpa brought into being doesn't have a grip on my eternal soul, even if I can understand doing some rather extreme things to keep myself from falling victim to her. I am not biologically built for fighting and winning. If anything, I'm biologically built to be dead, and it's only thanks to modern medicine I haven't died by age 3 tops. But some dude living his life in a small town just trying to get by, only fighting because the other option is to let Beastmen ruin everything he knows? Yeah, I can relate to that. Kind of. Maybe it's just my bias, but I think the non-human races are easier to relate to as well, even the evil ones. The Gotrek and Felix books make a point of talking about how the dwarfs truly are alien to the human thought process with how they think of timescales and their grudges, which is true. But I can also understand how they view things, even if I can never appreciate the why, if that makes sense. Given the context of how the lore builds them up, I can sort of understand why something as minor as forgetting to fully repay them for a loan puts you on Santa's naughty list forever. The Dark Elves may be hedonistic, evil warmongers, but some of their grievances against the High Elves make a small amount of sense.
Yeah, that's one thing too about the Dark Elves. They said his name. They said his name earlier, and I'm drawing a blank on it. But the Dark Elf leader, like I said, he was originally supposed to be the one in line to become the Phoenix King, and then he was nixed either because of some kind of prophecy or something, right? Like he and his brother, I think, were pretty close growing up, and he was in line to become the Phoenix King. He got nixed, and his brother became the Phoenix King, and then that led him down the dark path, and he started the Dark Elves, and then now they've been at odds with each other because since then. I don't remember exactly why. I don't remember if it was some kind of prophecy or if it was because of things that he was doing that the other high elves in power didn't like. You know, Malekith, yeah, Malekith. Um, but like his reasoning is one that actually has some justification behind it. You know, he was the one that was supposed to be next in line to become the Phoenix King, and he got screwed out of it from my understanding of the story and the lore. So like he has justification for going to war and doing the things that he, at least some of, you know, like the torturing and slavery and stuff like that, that is kind of similar to what the Drakari do in the 40k setting, is also kind of what the Dark Elves are known for and do. You know, they take things to the extreme the same way. But I mean, yeah, he has a level of justification for doing what he does. But yeah, I feel like never gave fantasy enough of a chance after dipping my toe in the lore recently. I think it's definitely got its own draw to it. Yeah, I saw that. It's all good. I still before Critter Cave because sci-fi, but fantasy is cool. Yeah, and I mean, I probably like, I don't know, like I like the extremes that are in the 40k universe. And again, like I really like just the feel of the 40k universe in general. And like I said, you know, like I don't know, growing up as a kid, I was really into, you know, ancient Greek mythology and the heroic tales, you know, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and you know, the tales of Hercules and stuff like that. And so like I don't know, it gives me the, like, hearing about the Primarchs and the things that they can do and the Emperor and all that kind of stuff, it gives me kind of a similar feel, right? You know what I mean? You know, the Emperor is kind of like Zeus and the Primarchs are his children and yada yada, you know, like that same kind of like mythological feel to it. I think that's one of the reasons why it really draws me to it. But some of the other factions are just also interesting too.
Malekith certainly doesn't deserve to be Phoenix King, but given how popular and devoted to Ulthuan he was, I can understand many people being bitter over him not being given the throne and trying to help him claim it. And while they are evil, it's an evil you can understand where it comes from. They're the idea of elven superiority taken to its horrible conclusion.
Right.
If you truly do believe you are objectively the best and everyone else is at most vermin, who cares if you're evil to them? Be as much a slave-driving warmonger as you want. I don't agree with the viewpoint, but it's a viewpoint I can see how they reached. Hell, the High Elves are an island-dwelling nation that, while still strong, are far past their prime and watching as the world passes them by in relevance. Did you know Games Workshop is a British company? The factional concepts and motivations of the setting are very easy to understand, even if you don't quite relate to all of them. And since I've blown my load all over this game's lore enough, my last positive will be that if you're also a history buff who's interested in fantasy like me, you'll love this setting on that virtue alone. The Empire of Man is the Holy Roman Empire if it had griffins and magic.
That's what I was saying earlier. The Empire of Man is literally just the Holy Roman Empire, basically like copy pasted over into Warhammer Fantasy.
Bretonnia is a vomit-inducing hodgepodge of Arthurian legends and every medieval stereotype you can think of. Cathay is ancient China if those cool terracotta statues...
Cathay, that's the faction name, is Cathay. They're another faction in Total Warhammer that I really like. And it's not the Jade Emperor, but it's the Jade Dragon, I think. I don't know. It's one of the newer generals. I did a campaign as him recently, and I had a lot of fun playing his side.
Were 100 feet tall and animated by magic to kick ass. All these factions regularly fight demons from hell, orcs, elves, and more. So if you fondly remember bashing action figures together as a kid but wanted to do that with Charlemagne and Legolas, this is the setting for you. Now onto the tabletop pros of the old world, and here's a bit of forewarning before we delve into things. Almost every positive I'm going to list is counteracted by a related negative. I don't think that's anything that kills this game by any means, I'm just saying it more as a heads up. You'll probably think that I'm phrasing certain things things very carefully or that I'm leaving something out, and I am in fact doing that intentionally. We talk about the good stuff and then the not so good stuff later, and they're usually related in this case. The head side of the coin comes before the tails. So first off, old world models. I've always wished GW would have just kept their old fantasy line around just for the sake of getting them. Well, now I don't need to be sad about that for the most part. The models of the old world are naturally old Warhammer Fantasy models. There is now no need to have to rebuy old orc boys for a 300% markup on eBay. You could just buy the orcs again as they are. As more factions are added once again to the range, you can expect this trend to continue on. I believe the dwarfs are up next as of the time of recording. So if you ever wanted to get yourself some vintage Warhammer minis, this game is full of them. As for the models themselves, there's two positives I'd like to put in the pros about them. For one, the new ones they're releasing look gorgeous. The Tomb King on the Skeleton Dragon, the new Ungrim Iron Fist model, even the new Bretonnia models look fantastic.
I wanna. That does look sick. I'm not gonna lie. Skeletal Dragon with I can't remember his name. Tomb King, what his actual name is. Begins with an S, I want to say, but yeah, that's pretty dope.
Tomb King on the Skeleton Dragon, the new Ungrim Iron Fist model, even the new Bretonnia models look fantastic, I have to admit. And for two, the models are all designed to fit together very well. I don't mean on a thematic level, although that is of course true. I mean literally fit them together. Fantasy is a square-based rank and flank game after all. Sometimes fitting models on the board or the shelf can be a pain in the ass, especially if one or two of those models have bits that extend pretty far off the base. Well, since old world models are all designed to be conjoined at the hip in a unit, they don't have this problem.
Yeah.
Sure, it does mean if you're a fan of some of the more outlandishly posed models of 40k and AOS, you might be disappointed, but you can have a much more orderly looking, easy to store force with these ones. The meat of your army is also going to be a fair bit simpler on average, I'd say. It'll generally be ranks of similar looking infantry, so painting and assembling them will usually be a pretty quick task. Few models are over-designed to hell and back, and most of those are the outstanding leader characters. And even if they're not posed in the most dynamic way, they're still undead skeletons or magical orcs. They're still fantastical, even if they're not waving their arms all over the place. As for the game itself, here's where the positive before the related negative thing is really going to be obvious. If you want a proper, complex game of Warhammer and wargaming in general, this is for you. And let's be honest, there is absolutely a market for that. Paradox games exist where people blow their load because they just unlocked a 2.5% research speed buff, and that's apparently huge. For example, Initiative has made its return to the fantasy side of things, among other stuff, so there's another layer of just pure stats to consider in your army. But for some more complex gameplay examples, did you know that the strategy and movement phases have 4 sub-phases each? There are in-depth diagrams and explanations on how exactly to order your models in your unit when they start fighting, as well.
I don't know anything about the tabletop side of things. I was gonna say both. I mean, I know a little bit more about the tabletop and 40k versus fantasy. I really don't know anything about the tabletop fantasy other than the factions. You know what I'm saying? So I have no idea like how it actually works. But I do find it interesting that the models do have like, I guess, a square base versus more of the circular bases that you see in 40k. So I guess that is like he's talking about more so because of how the grid system works, whatever, with movement, etc., etc. And that does kind of make more sense if you think about it, right? But anyway.
Well as how models that move into place to replace fallen ones cannot fight yet, or how that happens. This is all to say nothing of how templates of various sizes and shapes have returned, and there's a general feeling going through the core rulebook of this game is complex as fuck. There are explanations for exactly how flanking works down to the degrees of field of view a unit has.
Jesus.
If you want to break out your true tactical genius and use every single possible maneuver you can think of with all of them having some rules usage, this is the Warhammer game for you. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a boring game with nothing but infantry blocks and crap.
There's something to say about overcomplicating things, you know, right? Like, I think that's why D&D 5e, when that came out, like, became so popular, because it really kind of streamlined a lot of the rules and made it easy for newer people to really get into and understand. And then those that really wanted to kind of take things to the next level, there was always Pathfinder and some of these other variations of D&D that are a little more complex, you know? So Because like when you're new and you're coming into a game like that, like this, like, and you see like the different rules and how many of them there are, etc., like it can be very intimidating and overwhelming.
This is still Warhammer, after all. The Tomb King starter box comes with a skeleton dragon in it, and all their other constructs are here to play too. Now you don't need to go to Total Warhammer to jam it.
Yeah. And I mean, it makes sense. Like I said, I feel like the square bases make more sense than the circular ones, but I guess it also, like, I assume it's the movement rules are different in fantasy than 4K or 40K, I should say 4K. So like I guess the bases in 40K don't necessarily, you know, really matter in comparison. But I guess if in fantasy, like, it's more grid-based movement, it would make sense for the bases to be square, you know? My only question is, are there individual units attached to each other, or do they just line them up really close? Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
A sphinx down someone's throat. You can do it in person. The greenskins are, of course, orcs and goblins, and therefore all of their models are fun, but special shout out to both the Bone Grinder Giant and the Troll Hag. The Giant is just unga bunga big model in classic Warhammer Fantasy style, and the Troll Hag is something I can't show you uncensored on YouTube. It is god-awful to look at in the best possible way.
Yes,
and
thank you for the censor, actually.
It's probably my favorite of all the Warhammer games, which is something that's both a setting and gameplay pro. 40K is a sci-fi setting where the background battles have millions of people in each army, and AOS is the same but in Fantasyland. Every tabletop battle you play has the implication that in the lore of the battle, there's probably a couple 100,000 people immediately off-screen. But in fantasy, what you see on the tabletop is what would be fighting in the context of the setting. It's only a single Renaissance-era fantasy world after all. There are, of course, the occasional epic-level battles of thousands of elves fighting hundreds of thousands of demons or beastmen, but for the most part, what you see is lore-accurate scale. Also, since the ogres are a legacy army, more on that later, that means that as far as I know, the only major army with multiple wounds being the standard isn't really anything to worry about. So hey, if you know what you're doing, individual combat encounters won't take too long, all things considered. The majority of your army is only going to have one wound a pop, so getting that all taken care of won't be too big a task at all. That's not to say there's no massive monsters or heroes with tons of wounds and damage potential, but for the most part, it's going to be blobs of infantry fighting other blobs of infantry. And last tabletop positive...
So it sounds like tabletop and fantasy is more... What's the word? Numbers based, I guess. More about having as many units on the board as possible, I guess within the confines of like the points, and then how you utilize them versus, I guess, in 40K where like could have like custodies, right? You're gonna have less units on the field because they, you know, have more health and armor and do more damage than what you know, a normal group of Astra Militarum soldiers, you know, can do, etc.
Is that in some ways this is the cheapest Warhammer game around. Now you better believe we'll be coming back to the other side of this coin, but consider this. The Tomb King's box at this moment is $290 before tax and gives you dice, templates, the core rules, plastic measuring sticks that you're going to throw away immediately, and just a few miniatures. 93 of them to be precise. It also has a reference sheet.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it seems like fantasy is, the tabletop version's more about tactics and movement in utilizing your units and probably the environment and terrain to your advantage and flanking, etc. versus, like you're talking about, you know, this unit just kind of counters that unit. So we need to, you know, get the most efficient matchups per unit kind of situation
to play with that army as given. So even though it doesn't have the Ravening Hordes rules for the full roster, you can...
Of course, I've never played the tabletop of either, so I could just be, you know, talking out of my ass here, but from what I understand, that's what it seems like.
Play with this kit immediately. It adds up to 1,250 points worth of units. Being fully honest, given everything it comes with, I don't think it's all that pricey. A version without the rulebook would be nice to bring down.
I mean, I guess, right? Because, like, I mean, I could see the Tomb King here on the dragon, like I could see that unit probably being over $100 on its own, right? If you buy that on its own. So I mean, close to $300 for all of this, dice, templates, and the rule book. I guess technically that's not that bad of a deal. You know what I mean? Because I like, what is it? The oh, what are they called? I'm looking it up here right now because I've got it saved. The like starter faction things. What are they called? The combat patrol things. Like this Grey Knight combat patrol. It's $150 right now on Amazon, and you get essentially like a dreadnought and then like 7 or 8 Grey Knights to paint with it for half the price, essentially, of this, which is, you know, so, but I mean, again, it's not really an apples to apples comparison for different games and played in different ways, you know, so.
Down the cost, but it's not the worst deal ever. The Greenskin Battalion box only has minis and transfer sheets, but it cost $170 for 73 models. I'm gonna be honest with you, with the assumption that also tallies up to roughly 1,250 points, I don't think that's a good deal by GW standards, I think that's just a good deal. For some more proof, you can get 36 archers and spearmen for the Tomb Kings for $80. That's just a bit more than $2 per mini. Would it be nice if they shrunk it down to 18 minis for 40, or maybe just rounded up to an even 20? Yeah, I think I'd prefer that. But for a lot of the old world kits, you get a substantial number of minis given what you're paying for them. So at least on the basic level of collecting the core necessities for your army, the old world is shaping up to be surprisingly cheap. And given recent happenings in AOS,
Yeah, I wonder,
by which I mean while I was recording,
like looking at these, right, like, are these set up to where like these can be detached from one another? So like someone attacks your skeletal spearmen here and a certain number of them die, can you just like detach these from the group and take them out and then just have the number that's left over there to, you know, still be used, kind of a situation? Or is it something where just like you're gonna have to have like a sheet of paper and kind of keep track of what group has, you know, however many units left in it, kind of a situation? You know, I don't know.
for them. So at least on the basic level of collecting the core necessities for your army, the old world is shaping up to be surprisingly cheap. And given recent happenings in AOS, by which I mean while I was recording this script, the Beastmen were entirely removed from Age of Sigmar to be put into the old world, you can assume this game is going to be sticking around for a bit. No wasted money on a product that'll be gone in 2 years. My condolences to Beasts of Chaos players, by the way. It makes no sense that they don't just have the Beastmen be available in both games like the demons are in all of them.
Yeah, that's something that I don't understand either, right? Like, why would you want to remove a faction? Like, unless you're updating them and making them newer and something else, like, why would you want to just remove units that people might like and enjoy and want to spend money on? I don't know, that just doesn't make sense to me.
But now come the negatives. What does this game do poorly from the setting perspective? Well, first off, the old world is a prequel to Warhammer Fantasy, so it comes with the fact that we kind of know where all this is leading to. The Chaos Warriors gathering in the north are going to launch the...
See, to me, that's not necessarily a bad thing, personally, right? Like, sometimes prequel things, as long as they're done well, aren't necessarily always a bad thing, right? Like, you know, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good comparison, right? Like, the first one I think of off the top of my head is like the Hobbit movies versus the Lord of the Rings movies. Like, the Lord of the Rings movies are better than, like, that trilogy is better than the Hobbit trilogy, right? But the Hobbit trilogy isn't bad, you know? It expands, it goes, there's more stuff that happens in the movies, and there's definitely a lot of liberties that were taken to fill out the time and to, you know, add other characters and whatnot in. But that doesn't make the prequel bad, you know what I'm saying? They're not bad movies in my opinion. They're just not as good. And it does expand a little bit more on the universe and the lore, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So like, as long as they can do that, they can expand more, give you more information, and not do things that kind of take away from what's already established, then that's fine, in my opinion. Like, you already know what's going to happen. Okay, cool. At least we can see the events that lead up to what we know is going to happen. You know what I mean?
The Great War Against Chaos, and
I guess the best one would probably be Star Wars, right? Like in the theatrical canon release, you know, we go from episode 4 through 6, and then they did the prequels with, you know, Phantom Menace, Clone or not the Clone Wars. I always want to say the second one is the Clone Wars, but it, you know, that's what happens in between episode 2 and episode 3, and then, you know, we get Revenge of the Sith. So like, they don't necessarily take away from, you know, what we saw in Star Wars before. It just, we see that journey of Anakin and how he fell to the dark side, etc. You know, the only bad thing about it is nowadays, if you watch in episodic order instead of the canonical theatrical release, the big reveal of, you know, Vader is Luke's father is obviously spoiled for you because you know that. So that moment doesn't hit as hard as it did, you know, back in the day. I always thought I'm an unabashed people fan. People can come at me all they want all over those movies. I'm the same way, man. Attack of the Clones, yeah. I don't think the prequels and the originals, I don't think any of those are bad movies whatsoever. There are some that are better than others, obviously. And there's definitely times like towards the end of Phantom Menace, there's a lot going on. There's like 4 different story arcs and plot lines going on at the same time. So it was a lot to juggle. But at the same time, like it's they're good. To me, I don't have a problem with any of them, really. You know, some are just better than others. There's definitely some writing issues that could have been better with some of the lines and things like that. And, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But I like the prequels. I don't have a problem with them. Out of the sequel trilogy, honestly, for The Force Awakens is the only one that I found good. I mean, Rise of Skywalker and The Last Jedi, trash in my opinion. But anyway, that's a video for a whole different that's a whole different video.
Magnus the Pious is going to style on them. The Dark Elves will around the same time invade Ulthuan, and Tyrion and Teclis will chop and fireball their way through the entire invasion force. The Skaven are busy with the Second Skaven Civil War, so they're mostly going to be out of commission for the duration of the Old World. Same general problems the Horus Heresy has. It may expand on the lore, which is usually nice, but it also means we know going in how this is roughly going to turn out. There may be new revelations about existing plot points, but probably nothing substantial in terms of outright new stuff. But unlike the Horus Heresy, we have the added bonus is that this is a prequel to Warhammer Fantasy, which means the plot points this setting will expand upon or even introduce all end the exact same way. The Warhammer world exploding in a shower of disappointment. GW has stated the end times will remain canon, so everything that's expanded upon here is going to end that way no matter what. If you'll allow me to huff astronomical amounts of copium for a moment, if this game keeps doing extremely well in terms of sales, they might...
So I guess canonically what's going to happen is they'll have the old world, which will lead into the end times, and then the end times is what happens. The world gets destroyed and remade, I guess. And then it goes into Age of Sigmar. I guess that's how things play out.
Go down the storm opium for a moment. If this game keeps doing extremely well in terms of sales, they might go down the Storm of Chaos timeline instead. That would have me over the moon. But most likely, you have to play this game with the knowledge that everything in the setting ultimately amounts to nothing. That doesn't mean it can't be enjoyable. The best Star Wars content in my mind has been stuff like the Clone Wars show, and we know damn well that it all amounts to, and then most of the Jedi die and the Empire arises. But it does suck at least some of the fun out of things. Warhammer Fantasy also has always been the smallest scale Warhammer setting. This is something I consider to be a feature, not a bug, but it's worth noting. It makes the world much more approachable, since I can register the scale of a country a lot better than I can a galaxy-spanning empire, or 8 functionally infinite realms of reality.
I mean, that is true, right? Like, and that's even just a problem in the actual lore of the universe itself, is like, the Imperium is so vast and so spread out across the galaxy that they can't even keep track of what's going on. They don't even know how many worlds they actually have, they don't even know what year it really is, right? Like, things are so foobar with how expanded they are. And I mean, there's even worlds that don't even know that they're at war and everything. They think everything's hunky-dory and stuff's peaceful, and they don't know anything about chaos and all these other Xenos factions and yada yada. So like, there are things that are so like grand and expanded on in the 40k universe that, yeah, I can understand how the appeal of, like, the setting takes place essentially on fantasy Earth, on fantasy Earth continents, and that's kind of a scale that you can comprehend and understand more.
But like I said earlier, the battles you play in-game are pretty accurate to the scale of the setting, so if you like imagining every battle you play on the tabletop to actually be millions of people duking it out, the setting may leave you a bit disappointed. And as much as it hurts me to admit it, Warhammer Fantasy is somewhat generic, for all that the races are unique from other fantasy
Yeah, that is something that I'd always kind of thought about too, like even just playing Total War, the Warhammer games, like, it's fun, obviously, and I like I said, I think as of now, they're still like the best um strategy games you can get right now, as far as it goes. You know, I miss the old school RTS games. You know, I miss the Command and Conquerors and, you know, the StarCrafts and whatnot. But for what we have now, the Total War Warhammer games are pretty much the best there is around. But there is kind of a generic feeling of, yeah, this is fantasy setting, fantasy elves, fantasy humans, yada yada. But I mean, like, that's kind of what you're getting into, right? Like, that's what you understand going into it.
counterparts. There's nothing like AOS, where the standard fantasy races exist, yeah, but in ways unlike any other.
Yeah. And I mean, it's also just like how, when you make a universe of that scale, like, it just becomes so difficult to keep track of everything. So like, they basically just made it canonically, you know, they just made it canon that the Imperium doesn't even know what's going on. The Imperium isn't able to keep track of everything. Becomes Game Workshop can't keep track of everything.
The high elves of the old world are high elves, for instance. You know what you're gonna get. There's no weird stuff with
Right.
geometry spirits and cows like what with the Lumineth. So if you want something a bit weirder with your fantasy, Warhammer Fantasy doesn't always deliver. It can, but not too often. To be honest with you though, I'm out of lore cons for the old world. Warhammer Fantasy is what got me into Warhammer through Total War, and for a variety of reasons, it's my favorite Warhammer setting. Regardless of how you feel about GW blowing fantasy up way back when and then bringing it back, Warhammer the Old World is Warhammer Fantasy. It's the same minis, same rules, same setting, and this is a setting I'm vastly biased in favor of. As for the tabletop cons of the setting though, yeah, I have some criticisms. Let's get to the other side of all those coins now. Being generous, I said Warhammer Fantasy is perfect for those of you who want the most in-depth strategic and tactical gameplay out of a Warhammer game. Being less generous, this game is the tabletop wargame equivalent of drowning in Microsoft Excel spreadsheets. The best way I can word it is
Yeah,
that there
I
is
can
no
see that.
casually playing Warhammer the Old World. There is playing it non-competitively, but casually implies you can pick up a few hundred points of minis with some friends
Yeah.
and just go to town. I cannot imagine a game of the Old World lasting less than several hours, where if things are going fast in a smaller point game of 40k or AOS, you can reasonably finish that in an hour if you really rush things through.
Yeah. I mean, I do feel like, well, and I could see that for, I don't know, because like, there's that series on YouTube, you know, 40k in 40 minutes, you know, where they battle out in their little settings. So it is definitely possible to do 40k games in less than an hour, but like, it seems like, because of the scale and the strategy behind what they're doing here, that, yeah, it's gonna kind of be like, okay, this is gonna be this is gonna take your day. It's like playing a session of D&D, right? Like, if you're playing a session of D&D, you're looking at minimum 3 or 4 hours of that day being taken up, you know, playing a game of D&D with your buddies. So yeah, I could see this being the same way.
This is of course both a time investment as well as a knowledge investment, because you will be pouring through a whole lot of miscast and misfire tables, rules for moving and replacing units, and all sorts of other things that complicate the game a bit. Again, this can be a positive, but I feel it's best to be honest about what you're getting into. War games are already the paradox of tabletop gaming, and the old world is the paradox of Warhammer. Ignoring the setting, when it comes to gameplay, there's a reason GW switched over to circles in Age of Sigmar. It's a clunky and at times unwieldy system to use, not necessarily because it lacks critical features, but because there's so damn many features it's like trying to beat your opponent to death with the rulebook. Beyond that, at the time of recording this video, there are only 3 armies presently out. This is going to date the video, I admit, because yeah, eventually all the armies GW wants to add in are going to be there, and this criticism won't mean anything. But for the time being, if there's a fantasy army you really want to play, there's a pretty good chance you can't actually get it yet. What's far more pressing is the fact that 7 armies of Old Fantasy are remaining in the Legends category. As far as I understand it, that means they're not only never getting rule updates beyond what they have now, not only are they not available for matched play, but they're also not going to have their models sold again, which is...
Really? That seems like a waste. You're not going to have the Lizardmen, Dark Elves, the Vampire Counts, the Ogres, Chaos... I could maybe see the Chaos Dwarves because there wasn't much done with them anyway. But Skavens and Chaos Demons, like the rest of these factions minus the Chaos Dwarves, are pretty big factions, man. Like that to me seems like a waste. I mean, I guess maybe Dark Elves, right? And maybe Skaven, just because of the timeline, right? Like the Dark Elves wouldn't necessarily be around until later, I think. And maybe the Skaven as well. But for sure, Lizardmen, Demons, Vampires, and Ogres would be. I don't know. That seems to me kind of like a little bit of a waste, but is what it is.
Which is all sorts of upsetting, because some of those armies include the Dark Elves and Vampire Counts. Some of the armies I kind of get, even if I don't approve of them being left out. You can still get demons from both the 40k and AOS stores, right, and the Chaos Dwarfs are being...
Right, yeah, I mean, the Chaos Demons in 40k are essentially the Chaos Demons in Fantasy, so I mean, I guess that is kind of a cheeky way of getting around that. You just use your 40k, you know, Chaos Factions minis, and as long as they're not Chaos Space Marines. I guess technically you could like use a Chaos Space Marine as long as they don't have a bolter or a plasma gun, you know. If they just have some kind of melee weapon, you could just say they're you know, a Chaos Warrior or whatever.
Being relegated to the sidelines even before the end times. But some of the Legends armies are some of the most influential ones in the entire setting, and they're not coming back. To cope once more, maybe if this game sells well, GW will realize they're missing out on potential profit and add them in. But for the time being, don't expect Malekith or Morathi to return to their old world incarnations.
I mean, I kind of see that also, though, as an opportunity for... I mean, again, though, I was going to say I could see it an opportunity for third parties to implement this stuff on their own, to like create lore and books and things like that, and maybe even their own, you know, 3D printable models, etc. for these factions. But then as I was thinking that, I was also thinking, well, it's Games Workshop. They're probably not going to let that happen. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know. But yeah, I mean, that does seem like again, like I could understand maybe a couple of these factions not being around just because of like where things in the timeline end up. Like, I don't know if the Dark Elves technically were around at that time, because I don't know if Malekith was born yet. And I think he said the Skaven were going on in their civil war at that time, so they didn't have really a whole lot of influence. So that can make sense. But I mean, the Lizardmen were literally the first race. Chaos Demons were around even before them. The Vampire Counts are one of the major races. I guess maybe you could say for them as well, they didn't start showing up until later. But the Ogre Kingdoms were one of the earlier races too, so I don't know. Anyway.
Now, let's return to pricing. I meant it when I said that when it comes to collecting models, either for getting the core of your army or just collecting them, this game is cheap. Again, $170 for 73 models in the Orc kit. Assuming that's going to be standard for every army, that's incredible. And a lot of the characters are pretty cheap, with a $15 price tag not being a rarity. But expanding past the essentials and certain character units, the price point starts racking up pretty quick. $50 for 5 Orc Biggins, $75 for 5 Mounted Yeomen, $110 for 5 Ogres. Sweet Christ, who thought this was acceptable?
Yeah, that's a lot.
Some of these kits are absolutely overpriced. There is no way around it. The giant I mentioned earlier is...
And that's crazy, right? Because like you said, like those ones are definitely overpriced and not worth it. Yet those other ones, you know, that big Tomb King one, etc., they seem like they were a pretty decent deal. He's right, though. It's going to get popular enough. They won't be able to resist bringing it back. I'm sure that'll probably happen. That'll probably be enough outcry. And maybe that's what Games Workshop is waiting for, right? They're purposely saying we're not going to bring them back so that people will voice their opinion and want it more, you know, kind of a thing.
The worst example.
The reverse psychology.
The Sons of Behemoth are an entire army of giants in Age of Sigmar, and their most expensive models are $20 less than the $230 price tag this guy has. They also look infinitely less shit. When you start expanding past the bare essentials for an army, the cost can certainly rack up. And even having said the core stuff can be pretty cheap, let me go through the Tomb King's reference sheet the starter box has. Like I said, it's 1250 points. That's a decent amount, not a small army by any means. The thing is, 335 of those points are in the Hierophant on the Skeleton Dragon. A quarter of this army is in the big centerpiece model. Yeah. There's a reason these games are called rank and flank beyond the square bases. You have massive ranks of infantry walking up the board, and you've got to pay for those dudes. The Skeleton Spearmen are 115 points for a regiment of 20, and the Archers are 85 for 20. The Skeleton Cavalry are 122 points for 8, and the Horse Archers are 94 for 8. Depending on how you set up your old world army, you can potentially expect to pay a lot for what on their own are not too pricey kits. And of course, there's the time investment of assembling, painting, and just playing and moving all these hundreds of models. In the old...
So it almost kind of sounds like, because the fantasy setting, you're going to have more models, they're almost kind of being super greedy by setting the price points up that way. Like they're kind of, it almost seems like, yeah, they're intentionally setting the starter kits up to be cheaper, but then once you kind of like get into it and you want to buy some smaller, you know, unit kits to fill out your army more, that's where they're going to get you with the price gouging. I think I know what he's going with here.
Old world, almost every army can be the equivalent of a 40k or AOS Horde army. Expect your old world games to be a fair bit larger than AOS games or 40k games in pure model count, a model count you're going to be paying for in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
Again, it can be done cheaply, but can be and will be are different things. And my last table-out criticism is the models themselves. Once again, I meant it when I said it's nice to be able to collect these old models again. If nothing else, I don't think I was able to find Setcha for less than $150 on eBay, and now I can grab them for $60. That's great. But these are old models. Some of them hold up alright. The Orc Boys, I think, are just fine. Others, though, oh boy, those Orc Biggins are pretty pathetic looking. I'm pretty sure they're smaller than the regular boys, and either way, they definitely look less intimidating. They're supposed to be the big...
I mean, to me, those look like goblins. Those don't look like orcs to me, but...
lads in the tribe, short of the boss and maybe some black orcs that are hanging around, but they look like they haven't eaten in 3 months. These guys need an update, which is a shame to be saying for a game system that's technically less than 6 months old. And worst of all to me is the sheer amount of metal models. I'm going to tell you right now, I hate them. Most of what you'll be using is plastic, at least for the mainline infantry of your faction. But let me tell you, from the bottom of my heart, how painful it is putting Settra's model together. The horses are plastic, but everything else is metal. So you put the horses together, and it's fine. And even putting the chariot together, as well as Settra himself, is fine, as long as you've got some super glue handy. But gluing the chariot and the horses together is 7 layers of modeling hell. They refuse to stay together. I thought it'd be a great way to start my Tomb King's army. Put Settra together first to lead them. After all, he is Settra the Imperishable. If you have him, assembling anyone else before him is an insult to his glorious name. But I've practically drowned the chariot in super glue, and the chariot bits that connected to the horses just refuse to stick. Maybe it's just a me problem. Maybe I'm not worthy to assemble Settra after all the Nagash propaganda I've been pumping out. But if this is anything remotely indicative of what other metal models are going to be like, you're in for suffering. Also, painting metal models just kinda sucks. I painted a model for my dad once, not a Warhammer model, just a Demogorgon one since he likes Stranger Things, and painting it was unpleasant. With how prevalent metal is in the old world, you're gonna be dealing with that a lot. All that being said, do I think the old world is worth getting into? Absolutely. This is beyond all other things the original Warhammer. When GW envisioned how to play the game, this was it. And it's just a phenomenal setting full of character and life. Sure, it isn't perfect, not by a long shot, but if you want something with this level of complexity, or are willing to put in the work to acquire that taste, absolutely get in on it. At this point, the worst thing I can say about starting to get into the old world is that the models are selling so well that they're consistently out of stock, and that genuinely makes me kinda happy. I always assumed that when it comes to tabletop, Warhammer Fantasy was gone. That Total War and
Well, you would think then that means that, yeah, Games Workshop would see that and be like, okay, let's support this more.
Vermintide were all that was left, and that when this game did finally launch, it would launch to mild interest at most. Clearly, it hasn't. The old world is back in style, and if even the orcs are selling out after the game has had some time to be out and in people's minds, I've got high hopes that this will continue. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You were the Warhammer Fantasy to my old world, the foundation upon which all of this is built. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there.
All right, there we go. There we go. That was Do or Don't Warhammer the Old World by Pancreas No Work. Links will be down below in the description as always to the original video without my commentary and reaction, and to Pancreas No Work's channel. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video as we went through it, be sure to go give it a like, and if you enjoy the man's content on his channel, be sure to hit that sub button and show him some love. So yeah, I mean, the video kind of gives a brief summary of the factions and some of the creation lore of the universe, and then gets into his opinions of the tabletop setting as it is now, and some of the situations and issues with it, some of the pros and cons, etc., etc. And he gives his opinions on what he really kind of likes about fantasy versus 40k. And I can agree with him on a lot of different things. I mean, like, if you're someone that you look at the scale of like 40k as a universe and how expansive it is, and it's literally galaxy expanding to the point where even the Imperium, the faction, you know, itself in that universe doesn't even know like all of the worlds that it owns, and doesn't even know the exact date and year and time and all of these things, because there's just too much for them to take, you know, an account of, you know. And then you look at Warhammer Fantasy and it's like, yeah, this is Fantasy Earth with like Fantasy Earth continents and you know, factions that are a little more understandable and relatable. Then yeah, fantasy, you know, the fantasy setting might be more of something to get into with, you know, well-established books, and it seems like they're maybe gonna flesh out, like I said, it looks like the fantasy setting is gonna have 3 time periods now. They have the old world, which I guess they're kind of fleshing out. It's the Star Wars prequel episodes, where we're gonna learn more about how some of these factions started and how some of the wars and grudges that led up to the end times, before, you know, the end times happen and chaos kind of destroys the world, that then reformed into Age of Sigmar, which is what they're doing, you know, with the present fantasy timeline moving forward, you know. So it seems like tabletop wise it is going to be, as far as rules go, much more in depth, much more tactical. So like he said, like, for someone that just is like casually maybe looking to dip their toe into it, and again, as the title of his video says, you're either going to get into it or not. You're either going to have to make that jump and plunge into the fantasy stuff or not. You're either commit or you don't. And it sounds like just learning the rules is going to be something that will, I mean, with most games, it's just play it and you learn as you play, right? Like, that's just how it is. But the tabletop and fantasy in particular with the old world sounds very much like it's just very in depth. And again, that has its pros and cons. To me, once I learn, were I to get into Warhammer Fantasy in the tabletop, once I really understood and learned the rules, I would probably appreciate the more in-depth tacticalness of it. But at the same time, sometimes having too many rules can actually be a detriment and take away from the fun and experience and enjoyment, right? There's kind of like that fine line of having too many things and you get diminishing returns, and that takes away from the enjoyment of it. So I don't know. For me personally, I don't know if I would ever really get into Warhammer Fantasy versus 40K. I have much more of an interest in getting into 40K tabletop first and experiencing that and trying that. I also just, from the models that I've seen, which, to be fair, I haven't really seen a lot of the fantasy models, but in comparison, the minis in the 40K universe to me just look more interesting, and I have more of a want to collect and, you know, get into painting those. You know, like I have a Grey Knight starter set that I still need to put together and paint, which hopefully I will be doing soon. So you can look forward to that video coming up with the channel, or a stream of that, one or the other or both. So for me personally, I don't know if I would ever get into the fantasy tabletop. If I did, it would probably be after I've been well established, or I should say, well, I have well established myself in the 40K tabletop game and gotten used to that, and then would want to maybe jump into something a little more strategic. But I don't know. There's also the fact that there's the Total War Warhammer games, and if I really want to, I can just literally jump in and play it there. I can do that whenever I want to with all the factions there. I don't have to worry about buying minis, painting minis, finding someone to play with, you know, and going through the trouble of setting everything up. Even though I'm sure that is an enjoyable and unique experience of its own, you know, the Total War Warhammer games for me, as far as the fantasy setting stuff goes, would be enough for me to enjoy. You know what I'm saying? So, but yeah, that's gonna do it for this one here, guys. So we're gonna be checking out more going forward with the Warhammer Fantasy universe, probably getting into more videos, getting in depth in the factions and the lore, the setting, and the differences, I guess, from the old world to the end times, the Age of Sigmar. I am curious to know, like, what happened with the end times that leads into the Age of Sigmar and the Age of Sigmar lore, you know, going forward. Because, like, I don't know, I mean, does that mean, like, from the end times Sigmar has returned and he's leading humanity again, kind of a situation? You know, I don't know, but from what I understand from the fantasy lore now, you know, Sigmar was around way back when, helped unite and establish humanity, then, you know, did his heroic walk into the sunset, and that's all I really know of him, essentially. So anyway, yeah, thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, consider leaving a like and subs. It helps me and the channel grow. If you'd like to join us during these live reactions, as I'm doing right now with my YouTube members, we'd love to have you guys come in and hang out, join our discussions. There is a join button underneath the video, as well as the link in the description to the YouTube membership benefits and tiers that I offer. If you've been around the channel for a while, decide you want to take your sport to the next level, check those out and see if that would have any interest for you. But yeah, it's gonna do it for this one, guys. Have a good one. See you on the next one.